Welcome to your channel, Silent Mind Studio, and thank you for listening to us today.
It's great to be diving into this one.
Absolutely. We're about to embark on a deep dive into, well, one of the biggest mysteries out there, really. Science, philosophy, they've been grappling with it forever.
Consciousness.
Exactly. The nature of consciousness. It's a topic that's, genuinely intrigued us for a long time, just this fundamental puzzle. What does it even mean to be aware?
And you've given us a fantastic set of source materials, articles, papers, notes, lots to get our teeth into.
Yeah, a real wealth of information. So our mission here, our goal for this deep dive is to take all this fascinating stuff you've shared and really pull out the key insights.
We want to make sense of it for you. We'll look at, why it's so hard to define, what the leading theories are trying to say.
Right, and the evidence for and against those theories, the big debates happening right now.
And tackle some of those really controversial questions that inevitably come up.
Think of this as, well, maybe a shortcut. A way to get genuinely well-informed on this incredibly captivating subject without getting totally bogged down.
We're looking for those moments, those surprising facts maybe, that make you think. And the key takeaways from the material you sent over.
All delivered conversationally, we hope, not like a lecture. We really want to help you understand what's crucial in these sources, sort of navigate the complexity.
And maybe spark even more curiosity about this ultimate mystery.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Where do we even start? I guess the most fundamental challenge, maybe? Something that seems simple, but isn't.
Defining it. Just trying to define consciousness.
Right. We all feel like we know what it is, don't we? To be conscious, to be aware. But the sources you've given us really hammer home that getting a precise, agreed-upon definition is actually one of the first, maybe biggest, hurdles.
It's formidable, truly. The word consciousness, it covers such a huge range of things, different phenomena, different interpretations.
Like what specifically?
Well, everything from just being awake versus asleep, to having really complex thoughts, feeling emotions, having a sense of self, It's a massive umbrella term.
And because it's so broad, just agreeing on where to start defining it is incredibly hard.
Exactly. And the sources point out this isn't just arguing about words, about semantics. The fact that there are so many definitions actually reflects these really deep disagreements about what consciousness fundamentally is.
Is it purely physical? Like just brain states?
Or is it something that emerges from the physical brain in some special way? Is it about what it does, its function, what it lets a system achieve?
Or is there something else, something not entirely physical?
Right. And where you land on that basic question massively shapes the kind of theory you're going to build, the kind of research you think is important. It sets the whole direction.
Okay, so given that massive challenge, what are the sort of core concepts we can pull out from the sources? A starting point, at least.
Well, at the most basic level, it's often described as, the state of being aware of yourself, aware of your environment.
That fundamental sense of awareness.
Yeah, and that includes subjective experience, your own private, internal world, sentience, and that really key what it is like aspect of being in a particular state. One source really emphasizes that, what it's likeness.
And the dictionaries, how do they define it for, everyday understanding?
They give a pretty good baseline. Cambridge says something like, the state of being awake, thinking, and knowing what is happening around you. Oxford adds layers, like a person's awareness or perception of something, and also awareness by the mind of itself and the world.
So awareness of the world, awareness of the self.
Right. There seem to be common threads.
And has the meaning changed over time? Historically, did people mean the same thing when they said consciousness?
Not really, no. The sources show an evolution. Historically, it was often used more narrowly. It tended to refer more to our inner life.
Inner life, like thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. Private mental stuff. Introspection, thinking your own thoughts, imagination, making choices, volition, things happening inside your head.
But now it's broader.
Much broader, yeah. Over time, the term expanded. Now it often covers almost any kind of thinking, any experience, any feeling, any perception, whether it feels internal or it's about the outside world.
And that widening scope makes it even harder to pin down today, I guess.
Definitely part of the challenge.
Okay, this broadening and the historical shift.
Yeah.
It really underscores why we need more precision. And the sources highlight a really key distinction made by the philosopher Ned Block. This seems absolutely vital for sorting out what different theories are even talking about.
Yes, P consciousness versus A consciousness.
Exactly. Phenomenal versus access consciousness.
Absolutely critical distinction. Block introduced it, to bring some much-needed clarity.
Yeah.
Because people were using the same word consciousness to talk about very different things.
So let's break that down. P consciousness first. Phenomenal. What's that?
P consciousness is the raw, subjective experience itself, the feeling, the qualitative character of our sensations, our emotions, our perceptions.
So what it's like.
Precisely. It's the immediate felt quality. The sources describe it as that what it is like aspect, the feeling of seeing moving colored forms, hearing sounds, having bodily sensations, experiencing emotions and feelings with our bodies at the center.
So the actual feeling of pain or the unique quality of seeing the color red or tasting coffee?
Yes, it's the subjective feel, what it's like to be you right now having this specific experience.
Okay, there's P consciousness, the raw feel. What about A consciousness? Access.
But consciousness is defined very differently. It's not about the subjective feel, it's about function. It's about information that is accessible within your mental system.
Accessible for what?
Accessible for things like verbal report, for reasoning, for controlling your behavior. So if you perceive something, say a red apple, the information about that apple, it's red, it's round, it's over there, becomes access conscious if it's available for you to think about, I see an apple, talk about there's an apple, or used to guide your actions, I'll reach for the apple.
So information that's sort of globally available in the mind.
Exactly. Information you can consciously recall from memory or deliberate thoughts you're currently having, those also fall under A consciousness. It's about the information being poised for use.
Okay, P is the feeling, the raw subjective quality. A is the information being available for use in thought and action. Why is separating these two so important when we look at theories of consciousness?
Because, and the sources really stress this, many scientific theories, especially in cognitive science and neuroscience, are actually pretty good at explaining A consciousness.
How so?
Well, they propose plausible mechanisms, computational models, neural networks for how information gets processed, integrated, made available for report, used to control behavior. They can explain how we perceive something and then use that info to describe it or react.
But they struggle with P consciousness.
That's where the big challenge lies, especially philosophically. These functional theories often don't explain why having that accessible information should be accompanied by any subjective feel at all. Why does processing the wavelength for red light result in the experience of seeing red? Why isn't it just information processing without any accompanying subjective glow?
So a theory might explain how we know it's red, but not why it feels red.
Precisely. And a truly complete theory of consciousness, if such a thing is possible, would really need to account for both P and A. Or, at the very least, any theory needs to be upfront about which aspect it's trying to explain. Because solving the A consciousness puzzle doesn't automatically solve the P consciousness puzzle. And P consciousness is usually where the hard problem really bites.
Right, and speaking of distinctions, the sources make another important one. Consciousness versus self-awareness. They're related, but not the same thing.
Exactly. Consciousness, as we've been saying, is that general state of awareness of your body, the environment, internal feelings. Self-awareness is, well, it's a step up. It's the recognition of your own consciousness, your own identity.
So it's being aware that you are aware.
Yeah, and understanding yourself. It's how you experience and understand your own character, your feelings, motives, desires, seeing them as belonging to you.
The sources mentioned a philosophical breakdown here, too.
Yes, sometimes philosophers distinguish between state self-consciousness, being aware of your current conscious state, like noticing, I am feeling happy right now, and subject self-consciousness, being aware of yourself as the ongoing subject or agent who has all these experiences over time.
Okay, so it shows there's a difference between just having an experience and reflectively understanding yourself as the one having it.
Exactly. It adds another layer of complexity.
So given all these layers, P consciousness, A consciousness, self-awareness, where does the term consciousness usually land in philosophical debates, especially when we're talking about the really tough problems?
The sources point out that historically, philosophers used consciousness for at least four main things: general knowledge, intentionality, how mental states are about things, introspection, looking inward, and the knowledge we get from that, and finally, phenomenal experience, the raw feel.
And the focus now.
While all are important, the sources state that the main focus of the report, And indeed, much of the current debate is really on introspection and especially phenomenal experience.
Why is too?
Because they are absolutely central to what's widely considered the single biggest challenge in the whole field. The thing that really keeps people up at night.
Which is?
The hard problem of consciousness.
Ah, yes. The hard problem. Coined by David Chalmers. This is where things get really fascinating and, frankly, a bit mind-bending. Let's get a precise definition based on the materials.
Okay. The hard problem really crystallizes that central mystery, the part that seems to resist standard scientific explanation. Chalmers defined it as the problem of explaining why and how. Why and how do purely physical processes in the brain?
Neuron firings, chemical reactions, electrical patterns.
Exactly, all that physical stuff. Why and how does that give rise to subjective qualitative experience? To P consciousness? To qualia?
It's asking, why is the lights on inside? Why is there any experience at all accompanying these physical processes?
Right. And beyond that, why this particular kind of experience? Why does this specific pattern of neural firing feel like seeing red, and that other pattern feel like the pain of a headache? Why not some other feeling? Or, crucially, why not no feeling at all?
It's that fundamental, why does it feel like anything question. It seems like describing the mechanics doesn't answer the why.
Precisely. Chalmers' formulation was so powerful because it really shifted the focus. It said, look, it's not enough to just describe how the brain functions, how it processes information, reacts, remembers. We need to explain why performing those functions feels like something from the first-person perspective.
It highlights what people call the explanatory gap.
Exactly. A gap between our objective third-person description of the physical brain and the subjective first-person character of our experience.
And Chalmers contrasted this hard problem with the so-called easy problems.
Right. He used the term easy problems maybe a bit tongue-in-cheek because they're still incredibly hard scientifically, but easy relative to the hard problem. These are the aspects of mind and behavior that seem like they can be tackled by standard cognitive science and neuroscience methods.
Things explainable by computation or neural mechanisms.
Yes. Things like, how does the brain integrate information from different senses? How do we categorize things we perceive? How does attention work to select information? How are memories stored and retrieved? How can we talk about our internal states? These are seen as problems of explaining functions or abilities.
And the idea is, once we figure out the mechanism, we feel like we've explained it.
Largely, yes. They're considered functionally definable. If we understand the neural circuits or the algorithms that perform these functions, we generally feel like we have a good explanation. There isn't usually a lingering, but why does that function exist? Mystery in the same way.
But subjective experience, P consciousness, doesn't fit that functional mold so easily.
That's the core issue. Even if you had a perfect map of the brain activity involved in seeing red, showing exactly how the brain processes the light waves and triggers the verbal report that's red, you still haven't explained why that processing results in the subjective feeling, the unique quality of redness.
That feeling itself doesn't seem to be just another function.
Right. It seems to be something extra, something not captured by just describing the functional steps. That's why solving all the easy problems, even if we could, wouldn't automatically solve the hard problem.
And qualia. Those are right at the heart of this difficulty, aren't they?
Absolutely central. Qualia are those subjective, qualitative properties we talked about, the redness of red, the specific pang of pain, the taste of salt, the raw feels.
And the Mary's Room thought experiment is designed to make us confront qualia and the challenge they pose, especially for physicalism.
Yes, exactly. Physicalism being the view that everything is physical. Mary's Room, developed by Frank Jackson, is a famous argument against that.
Let's quickly walk through it again because it really illustrates the puzzle vividly.
Okay. Imagine Mary. She's a brilliant neuroscientist, lives her whole life in a black and white room. She learns everything there is to know physically about color vision, all the physics of light, all the neurobiology, every single physical fact. She has the complete, objective, third-person story.
But she's never actually seen color.
Right. Her world is monochrome. Then, one day, she's released from the room and sees a red rose for the first time. The crucial question is, does Mary learn something new?
And the argument is, if she knew all the physical facts already.
But she still learned something new upon experiencing red.
Then that suggests there are facts about conscious experience, facts about the quale of redness, its subjective quality, that are not physical facts.
Exactly. It challenges physicalism by suggesting that a purely physical description of the world leaves something out, namely the subjective character of experience. The power of the argument is how intuitively it suggests that our objective science seems unable to capture the first-person reality. It highlights that explanatory gap.
But is this universally accepted? Do all philosophers agree that qualia are real and irreducible, or that Mary learned something non-physical?
Oh, absolutely not. Like everything here, it's fiercely debated. Some argue qualia are illusions or they're physical, just very complex processes we don't understand yet. Others defend qualia as real, irreducible features that physicalism just can't explain. Mary's room itself has generated countless counter-arguments and variations.
Okay, so this hard problem with qualia and subjective experience at its core, it really functions as a kind of a test for any theory of consciousness.
It absolutely does. It's a persistent philosophical benchmark. Any theory aiming for completeness has to confront it. Theories that only focus on the easy problems, information processing, attention, finding neural correlates without offering a plausible story about why their subjective experience, they get criticized for dodging the main issue.
It forces the field to look for deeper answers, beyond just mapping brain functions.
Precisely. It pushes towards more fundamental explanations.
Wow, okay. This is incredibly complex, but really sets the stage. Understanding the definition problems and the hard problem is clearly foundational before we look at the proposed solutions.
Indeed. It frames the entire challenge.
All right, before we dive into those proposed solutions, the actual theories, just a quick reminder for everyone listening. If you're finding this deep dive into the mystery of consciousness as fascinating as we are, please do subscribe to the channel and follow us. If you're interested in content like this, we discuss topics that intrigue us every day. And if any questions are popping into your head, please ask them in the comments. We genuinely enjoy answering them and building a conversation around these complex ideas.
Definitely. Engagement makes it much more rewarding.
Okay, so the hard problem highlights this explanatory gap. How are researchers and philosophers actually trying to bridge that gap, or at least map the territory? The sources you provided lay out some of the leading theoretical approaches.
Yes, the quest has led to several distinct, often competing frameworks. The sources highlight three that are particularly prominent in current discussions. Integrated information theory, usually called IIT,
Right.
global workspace theory, or GWT,
Okay.
and the broader idea of the emergent property hypothesis.
And these aren't always totally separate.
Not always mutually exclusive, no. As the sources note, emergentism can be seen as a more general stance. Consciousness emerges from complexity, while IIT and GWT offer more specific mechanisms for how that emergence might happen in the brain.
Got it. Let's start with IIT, Integrated Information Theory, developed by Giulio Tononi. This one has a reputation for being mathematically intense, maybe a bit abstract.
It is, and it's very ambitious in its claims. IIT's core idea is pretty unique. It says consciousness doesn't just arise from integrated information in a system, it is identical to it.
Identical to integrated information. What does that mean exactly?
It means consciousness corresponds to the maximum amount of irreducible intrinsic cause and effect power a system has over its own past and future states, how much difference the system's current state makes to itself, essentially.
Okay. And its approach is different too, right? It starts somewhere unusual.
Yes, that's key. IIT doesn't start with the brain and try to find consciousness. It starts with conscious experience itself with phenomenology and asks, what are the essential properties of any possible experience?
And it identifies some core properties.
It proposes 5 fundamental properties, or axioms, that it claims are undeniable truths about any conscious experience you could possibly have.
What are they?
Okay, briefly. 1, intrinsic existence. Your experience exists for itself from its own perspective, not for an external observer. 2, composition. Experience is structured. It's made of different parts or distinctions, like seeing shapes and colors in a scene. 3, information. Experience is specific. It's this particular experience and not countless others you could be having. 4, integration. Experience is unified. You experience everything together as a single whole, not as separate, independent streams of information. And 5, exclusion. Experience has a definite content and level of detail. It is what it is, no more and no less, at a specific grain.
Okay, so those are the claimed essential features of experience itself. How does that connect to the physical world?
IIT then derives corresponding postulates about the physical system needed to have those properties. The physical system must exert cause-effect power on itself, specify a particular state, form an irreducible whole, called a complex, and consciousness resides only in the maximally irreducible complex within that system. The specific pattern of these cause-effect relationships within the complex is called the A structure.
Which brings us to A, or phi. That's the famous measure in AIT, right?
Exactly. A is meant to be the quantitative measure of integrated information. According to IIT, the amount of fight quantifies the level of consciousness. High IT means high consciousness, like being wide awake. A equals 0 means no consciousness, like a simple switch or maybe a rock.
The A structure.
The A structure, the specific pattern of integrated information, defines the quality of the experience, what it's like. So one A structure is the experience of seeing red, another is the experience of hearing a bell.
So IIT is making a very strong claim here. Not just correlation, but identity.
Precisely. This is central to IIT's ambition. It proposes an explanatory identity. A specific conscious experience, quite literally, is the A structure specified by a physical complex in a certain state. The brain doesn't cause consciousness. Certain organized physical systems are consciousness because they have high integrated information.
And this identity claim is how IIT tries to tackle the hard problem.
Yes, it aims to essentially dissolve or obliterate the hard problem. If consciousness is a fundamental, measurable property of certain physical systems, then the question of how physics gives rise to experience is reframed. The experience is that specific physical property. It tries to build a bridge by definition.
That's definitely a radical approach. Okay, let's switch gears to global workspace theory, GWT, associated with Bernard Bars, and then expanded by people like DeHaan and Nakash into the global neuronal workspace theory, GNWT. This seems to come from a more functional cognitive science perspective.
Yes, GWT is much more rooted in cognitive psychology and neuroscience. It focuses on the computational architecture of the mind. The core idea is that consciousness works like a global workspace in the brain.
Like a central hub.
Kind of. Imagine a central broadcasting system. Information from lots of specialized, mostly unconscious processors competes to get into this workspace. Once information makes it in, it gets broadcast widely to many other unconscious systems throughout the brain.
And what does this broadcasting achieve?
It allows for integration. It brings together information from different places, sensory input, memory, current goals, and it allows for flexible coordination and control of behavior, especially when dealing with new or complex situations that require more than just automatic responses.
The theater analogy is often used here, isn't it?
It is, and it's quite helpful for getting the basic idea. In the theater metaphor, the conscious contents, what you're aware of right now, are like the actors or events happening on the stage. This stage has limited capacity, like working memory.
And attention.
Attention is the spotlight, illuminating certain actors on the stage, making them the focus of consciousness. The information on stage is then broadcast out to the audience, which represents the vast array of unconscious, specialized processors or modules in the brain. These audience members receive the broadcast and can act on it or contribute new information back.
So information from, say, vision or memory is competing to get onto that stage.
Exactly. There's competition among these unconscious streams. Once selected, the information enters the workspace and gets globally broadcast. This is thought to happen via neurons with long-range connections, linking different brain areas, particularly involving connections between the prefrontal cortex at the front and parietal cortex towards the back and top.
And attention is crucial for deciding what gets on stage.
Yes. Attention acts as a critical gatekeeper. It selects which information out of all the parallel processing happening unconsciously gains access to the limited capacity workspace and thus becomes conscious.
And this workspace content relates to things like working memory and decision-making.
Very closely. The information currently on stage in the workspace is essentially what's active in your working memory, what you're subjectively experiencing and can report on. This global availability of information is thought to be crucial for higher-level cognitive functions, like top-down control, planning, and deliberate problem-solving.
And the neural version, GNWT, points to specific brain activity patterns.
Yes. GNWT suggests this workspace is implemented by a distributed network, especially those frontoparietal areas. A key finding they point to is a characteristic neural signature. When a stimulus crosses the threshold into conscious awareness, there's often a late, happening a few hundred milliseconds after the stimulus, sudden widespread ignition of synchronized activity across these distributed brain regions.
As opposed to more localized activity for unconscious stuff.
Exactly. This widespread ignition is interpreted as the neural sign of information being globally broadcast, becoming available across the workspace.
Okay, so IIT starts from experience and posits NIT identity. GWT starts from brain function and posits global broadcast for access. What about the third one, the emergent property hypothesis?
Emergentism is a bit different. It's more of a general philosophical and scientific framework. Applied to consciousness, the core idea is that consciousness emerges from the complex interactions happening in the brain.
Emerges. Meaning?
It means consciousness is a property that arises from the collective activity of simpler components, billions of neurons interacting in intricate networks, but it's a property that isn't present in those individual components themselves. Your subjective experience isn't found in a single neuron, but it emerges from the organized activity of the whole system.
So the whole is more than the sum of its parts, in a way.
Exactly. It's seen as a novel, higher-level property of the system that's irreducible, at least in some sense, to just adding up the properties of the individual neurons.
The sources mentioned a distinction within emergentism, weak versus strong. John Searle talked about this.
Right. Weak emergence refers to properties that arise from interactions but are, at least in principle, predictable and explainable based on the lower-level parts in their interactions. Think of the patterns in a flock of birds. They emerge from simple rules followed by individual birds, and we can understand how. Or the wetness of water emerging from eco-molecule interactions.
And strong emergence.
Strong emergence is a much more radical claim. It suggests properties that are fundamentally novel, perhaps unpredictable even in principle from the parts, and genuinely irreducible. Consciousness is often put forward as the prime candidate for strong emergence,
Implying that consciousness might be a totally new kind of thing that pops into existence from brain complexity.
something like that. And if strong emergence is true for consciousness, it might mean that consciousness itself has new causal powers, the ability to influence things that aren't solely explainable by the underlying physics of the neurons.
Is emergentism still considered a physicalist view? Does it require anything non-physical?
Generally, yes, it's seen as physicalist because it says consciousness arises from physical brain processes. But strong emergence definitely pushes the boundaries of strict reductionist physicalism. The sources distinguish property emergentism consciousness is a novel property of physical stuff from the much less common substance emergentism, which would involve a non-physical substance emerging.
And does this emergent consciousness actually do anything? Or is it just along for the ride?
Most emergentist views argue it's not just an epiphenomenon, a side effect with no influence. They propose that emergent consciousness can have top-down causal effects, meaning the conscious state itself can influence the lower-level brain activity and subsequent behavior.
How do IIT and GWT fit with emergentism then?
As the sources suggest, IIT and GWT can be viewed as proposing specific mechanisms for how emergence happens. IIT suggests consciousness emerges via integrated information. GWT suggests it emerges via the functional architecture of global broadcast and access. Emergentism provides the broader philosophical umbrella that can accommodate these more specific mechanistic accounts.
Okay, that really lays out the main theoretical players, IIT, GWT, and emergentism. It's clear they have very different starting points and core ideas. Looking at that comparison table in the sources really drives home the contrasts.
It does. It's worth quickly running through those key differences again because they really shape the research of the arguments.
Go for it.
Okay. Core mechanism. IIT focuses on that measure of irreducible cause-effect power. GWT focuses on global availability, the broadcasting of information. Emergentism talks more generally about complex interactions.
Right. Nature of consciousness.
IIT sees it as intrinsic, fundamental, possibly leaning towards panpsychism. GWT sees it as a functional state of information access. Emergentism sees it as a novel property arising from complexity.
How they approach the hard problem.
IIT aims to dissolve it through identity consciousness as I. GWT primarily addresses the functional side, A consciousness, maybe leaving the Y of P consciousness open. Emergentism provides a framework for how it might arise, but the core Y of subjective feel might still remain. IIT proposes quantifiable but hard to compute. GWT looks at reportability, neural signals of broadcast. Emergentism is less direct, maybe inferred from system complexity.
What about AI consciousness?
IIT says possible if the AI has a high architecture, which current digital computers likely don't. GWT says possible if an AI implements a global workspace architecture. Emergentism says possible if AI reaches sufficient complexity and organization.
Location in the brain.
IIT often points to a posterior hot zone in the cortex. GWT often highlights frontoparietal networks. Emergentism suggests distributed network interactions.
And panpsychism.
IIT has strong leanings or implications towards it. GWT, generally not. Emergentism, not inherently, but it's compatible with some forms.
Yeah, laying it out like that really highlights the different assumptions and predictions. IIT's mathematical precision is attractive, but the difficulty of calculating A and the controversial panpsychism are big hurdles.
Right. And GWT aligns well with cognitive psychology and is more testable with current methods, but critics say it just explains access, not the subjective experience itself.
And the sources make the point that where a theory looks for consciousness in the brain flows directly from its core idea of what consciousness is. If you think it's about integration, you look for highly integrated networks. If it's about global access, you look for broadcasting hubs.
Exactly. The theory really guides the empirical search. We've kind of laid the groundwork now, design the terms, outline the core challenge, and sketch the main theoretical maps.
And now we need to look at how science is trying to find actual evidence for or against these maps, and where the main battle lines are drawn in the ongoing debates.
Right, into the empirical evidence and the controversies.
But first, one more reminder. If you're finding this journey into consciousness and its theories compelling, please do subscribe and follow the channel. We explore intriguing topics like this every day based on material you might find interesting. And please share your questions in the comments. We love digging into them and fostering discussion. It really helps us all learn.
Absolutely. The dialogue is key.
Okay, so stepping into the science lab, metaphorically speaking, how do researchers actually go about testing these often very abstract theories? What kind of evidence are they hunting for?
Well, the field is this dynamic mix, isn't it? Theoretical ideas constantly bumping up against empirical findings, leading to some pretty vigorous debates. A huge goal in neuroscience has been to find the neural correlates of consciousness, the NCCs.
NCCs. Define those for us again.
The NCCs are basically the minimum set of neural events or structures that are thought to be sufficient for a specific conscious experience to happen. What brain activity has to be there for you to consciously see that apple or remember that name?
And how do they isolate that specific activity? I mean, the brain's always doing something. How do you separate the consciousness part from everything else?
They use some pretty clever experimental setups. The basic idea is to create situations where the physical stimulus going into the brain stays roughly the same, but the person's conscious experience of it changes.
Like
Things like binocular rivalry. You show a different image to each eye, say a house to the left eye and a face to the right. What people report seeing flips back and forth between the house and the face, even though the input isn't changing.
so you can compare brain activity when they're seeing the house versus seeing the face.
Exactly. Or flash suppression, where showing flashes to one eye can make a steady image in the other eye disappear from awareness. Or perceptual masking, where you show a very brief target, and if you follow it quickly with another image, the mask, the target becomes invisible. In all these cases, the stimulus is physically there, but conscious perception flicks on and off. That allows researchers to look for brain activity that tracks the conscious perception, not just the raw sensory input.
And these experiments, the results, they're interpreted through the lens of the theories we just discussed.
Heavily. The sources make this really clear. Your theoretical starting point shapes where you look and what you expect to find. If you're an IIT proponent, you might focus on measures of information integration, maybe looking specifically in posterior brain regions, and see if those correlate with conscious reports.
Whereas a GWT advocate
Might look for evidence of that late, widespread ignition of activity, particularly in frontoparietal networks, correlating with the moment someone says, aha, I see it now. The same brain scan data can be interpreted quite differently based on the theoretical framework.
So what specific evidence gets brought up in support of IIT?
Well, IIT predicts consciousness levels should track integrated information, and it often points to that posterior cortical hot zone, parts of the parietal, temporal, maybe occipital lobes as the likely physical substrate, because its network structure seems suited for high integration. Since calculating I directly is super hard, they use proxies.
Like the PCI you mentioned.
Yeah. Exactly, the perturbational complexity index. They give a little magnetic pulse with TMS to stimulate the cortex, then use EEG to measure how complex and widespread the brain's electrical response is. The idea is that a more conscious brain, one capable of high integration, will react with a more complex, sustained echo of activity.
And does PCI correlate with consciousness levels?
Strikingly well, according to many studies cited in the sources. PCI is high during wakefulness, drops significantly during deep sleep or under anesthesia, and is typically very low in patients in a vegetative state. Interestingly, it can sometimes be higher in minimally conscious patients who might have some fluctuating awareness. This correlation is seen as strong evidence linking the brain's capacity for complex, integrated responses, a proxy for high, with the level of consciousness.
What about those adversarial collaborations where IIT and GWT folks teamed up?
Yeah, those are fascinating. Trying to design experiments that could potentially disprove one theory or the other. The Allen Institute study is a key example. It looked at the timing and location of brain activity needed for conscious visual perception. The results were complex, no clean knockout for either side, but some interpretations suggested that activity in posterior brain areas seemed more crucial for the fine details of conscious visual experience itself, perhaps lending more support to IIT's focus there, while maybe downplaying the necessity of the prefrontal cortex emphasized by GWT for the experience itself, though maybe not for reporting it. Other studies have tried applying IIT concepts, like identifying integrated core complexes, to animal studies, for instance, linking activity in the monkey parietal cortex to maintaining learned associations, suggesting a link between integration and function.
Okay, what about the evidence backing GWT?
GWT gets a lot of support from standard neuroimaging, like fMRI. Many studies show a correlation between someone reporting conscious awareness of a stimulus and increased activity in that distributed network involving prefrontal and parietal areas.
And the ignition signature.
Yes, that late, widespread burst of activity seen in EEG and MEG when a stimulus becomes consciously perceived is considered a hallmark prediction of GWT-GNWT, consistent with the idea of information being broadcast globally.
And its ability to explain cognitive stuff adds weight too.
Definitely. GWT provides a plausible framework for things like the attentional blink, why you miss a second target if it comes too soon after a first one. The idea is the workspace gets occupied by the first, making it unavailable for the second. The theory also aligns well with what we know about the brain's long-range communication pathways, particularly the corticothalamic system, which seems well-suited to support a global workspace function.
And the evidence for the broader emergentism idea. If IIT and GWT evidence can support it, what else points towards emergence?
Well, the most basic observation is just that consciousness clearly depends on the brain working as a complex, large-scale system. You don't get consciousness from a few neurons in a dish. So the evidence for specific mechanisms like integration, IIT, or global broadcast, GWT, can be seen as supporting emergence by detailing how it might happen. But also, the fact that consciousness is lost or dramatically altered when these complex networks are damaged, or when global patterns of activity are disrupted by things like anesthesia or deep sleep, strongly supports the idea that consciousness is a property of the whole functioning complex system.
Even brainwave patterns.
Yeah. EEG studies showing distinct global patterns of brainwaves like alpha rhythms during relaxed wakefulness or gamma oscillations during focused tasks suggest that the overall coordinated activity pattern across the brain is fundamental to the conscious state. It's not just about specific locations firing, but how the whole network orchestrates itself.
So it seems like there's compelling evidence marshaled for each perspective, but it's often complex, indirect, and open to interpretation based on the theory you favor.
That's a very good summary, which leads us directly into the major points of ongoing debate.
Because the interpretation of the evidence is where the disagreements really flare up.
Absolutely. The data might be agreed upon, but what it means is highly contested, often along deep philosophical lines. And perhaps the deepest, most fundamental fault line is still the age-old one. Physicalism versus non-physicalism.
Physicalism.
Yep.
Consciousness is purely physical, brain-based.
Right. That's the dominant view in neuroscience and much of philosophy today. It's grounded in all that evidence we just talked about, the strong correlations between brain and mind. If you damage the brain, consciousness changes. If you drug the brain, consciousness changes. Stimulate the brain, consciousness changes. Variants include identity theory, mental states or brain states, and functionalism, mental states are defined by their roles. Because we've had success explaining many other cognitive functions physically, the hope or expectation is that consciousness will eventually yield too. GWT and most forms of emergentism operate within this physicalist assumption.
But non-physicalism pushes back, saying there's something more involved.
Yes, arguing that consciousness involves something beyond just the physical configuration and activity of the brain. And the main fuel for this view is the persistence of the hard problem, that explanatory gap. If physicalism just can't explain the subjective what it's like, then maybe we need to look elsewhere.
Like dualism.
Dualism is one major form. Substance dualism, like Descartes proposed, suggests distinct physical stuff and mental stuff, but it famously struggles with the interaction problem. How could non-physical mind stuff possibly push physical brain stuff around and vice versa? Property dualism, which is more common now, Chalmers is a proponent, doesn't posit a separate substance, but argues that consciousness is a fundamental, irreducible property that emerges from complex physical systems, a property that itself isn't physical.
And Mary's room is used to argue for this property dualism.
Exactly. The argument is that Mary learns a new fact about a non-physical property, the quell of red, when she sees it, showing that physical facts aren't the whole story. The power of that thought experiment is how it vividly illustrates the apparent inadequacy of objective third-person descriptions for capturing subjective first-person reality.
And panpsychism. That's another non-physicalist, or at least non-standard physicalist view getting attention.
It is. Panpsychism suggests consciousness, or maybe some proto-form of it, isn't something that emerges only in complex brains, but is a fundamental feature of reality itself, perhaps present in some minimal form, even in very simple systems.
Like atoms or electrons having some tiny spark of consciousness.
That's the kind of radical idea it entertains. And IIT, by suggesting that any system with non-zero has some degree of consciousness, has really given panpsychism a boost in recent philosophical discussions. Some see it as a way to avoid the emergence problem. How does consciousness suddenly appear from non-conscious stuff? By making it fundamental from the start, maybe like charge or spin are fundamental properties of particles.
So it's an evolution from substance dualism to property dualism to maybe panpsychism, trying to fit subjective experience into our scientific picture.
You could see it that way, yeah. Different attempts to grapple with the subjective while trying to stay compatible with science. But panpsychism faces huge hurdles, too. It strikes many as deeply counterintuitive, incredibly difficult to test, and some critics, like John Searle, commenting on IIT's implications, argue it makes the concept of consciousness almost meaningless if it's everywhere.
Okay, so that fundamental physicalism versus non-physicalism debate, driven by the hard problem and the status of qualia, is still raging. What other key debates are highlighted in the sources?
Well, relatedly, there's the debate about the location and nature of consciousness in the brain. Is it primarily in those posterior regions IIT points to? Is it the frontoparietal network GWT emphasizes? Or is it more globally distributed and dependent on interaction patterns? And alongside that, the debate about qualia themselves. Are they real, irreducible, subjective qualities? Or are they ultimately just complex patterns of information processing, maybe even illusions generated by the brain?
And the whole issue of whether these theories are actually scientific, testable, falsifiable.
Huge point of contention. This is crucial for any scientific theory. IIT faces a lot of criticism here. Calculating EBITDA for something like the human brain is currently computationally impossible, making direct validation extremely hard. Its starting axioms are philosophical assumptions, not empirical findings. Critics argue it's difficult to design experiments that could definitively disprove IIT, leading some prominent scientists to label it unscientific, more like metaphysics.
And GWT.
GWT, being more focused on function and access, is generally seen as more empirically tractable. You can design experiments using cognitive tasks and neuroimaging to look for evidence of global workspace dynamics, like that ignition signature. Though even there, some argue concepts like broadcast or workspace can be a bit vague and need sharper operational definitions.
Finally, the role of attention is still debated.
Yes. GWT gives attention a starring role. It's the gateway to consciousness. But other views aren't so sure it's strictly necessary. Could there be forms of consciousness, maybe like the background hum of existence or certain states in meditation, that involve high integration, like in IIT, but don't require focused, selective attention? The exact relationship remains an active area of research and debate.
It's just incredible how many layers of complexity and disagreement there are. Strong theories, some really intriguing evidence, but deep divisions and major challenges remain.
It really speaks to the profound difficulty of the question we're asking. We're trying to understand the very nature of subjective awareness from the outside.
Okay, before we move into evaluating the strengths and weaknesses and concluding, let's tackle some of those really big, controversial questions that spin out from all this theory and debate. But first, our regular reminder. We really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive. If you like exploring these kinds of complex and intriguing topics, please subscribe and follow Silent Mind Studio. We bring you discussions like this every day. And seriously, drop your questions in the comments. We read them all and love the back and forth. It makes it all worthwhile.
Hear, hear.
All right. Controversial question number 1. Bringing the big debate down to earth. Is consciousness solely a product of brain activity? Or is there compelling reason, based on everything we've discussed, to think there might be something more?
This really gets to the heart of the physicalism versus non-physicalism clash. The arguments for consciousness being solely a product of brain activity are, incredibly strong from a standard scientific perspective. We have overwhelming evidence of correlation.
Damage the brain, affect consciousness. Drug the brain, affect consciousness. Stimulate the brain.
Exactly. fMRI, EEG, lesion studies, pharmacology, TMS. It all points to an incredibly intimate link between what happens in the physical brain and the state of consciousness. And many successful theories, like GWT and various emergentist accounts, operate entirely within that physicalist framework, aiming for explanations based solely on neural mechanisms and functions. The expectation within much of neuroscience is that we will eventually find a purely physical explanation.
That persistent, hard problem keeps suggesting maybe the physical story isn't the whole story, at least not for the subjective part.
That's the crux of the counterargument. The failure so far of purely physicalist accounts to convincingly bridge that explanatory gap to explain why physical processes should feel like anything is what keeps the door open for alternatives. If physicalism can't account for qualia, for subjective experience, then maybe something non-physical is involved.
Like property dualism.
Property dualism argues exactly that. Consciousness emerges from the physical brain, but possesses irreducible non-physical properties. Mary's room is the classic argument here. Experiential knowledge seems distinct from physical knowledge.
Or panpsychism.
Panpsychism offers another route, suggesting consciousness isn't something that emerges from complexity, but is a fundamental property of matter itself. IIT's implication that even simple systems have some produce gives this ancient idea new life. Perhaps brains are just incredibly good at amplifying and integrating a property that's already latent in the universe.
The sources also mention things like field theories or energy models. Less mainstream.
Yes, ideas suggesting consciousness might be related to electromagnetic fields generated by the brain, or some form of potential energy, rather than being strictly tied to neuronal firing. Some link these ideas to concepts like well-being or transcending purely mechanistic views of the mind, and underlying many non-physicalist views is that conceptual puzzle. How do you get consciousness just by combining non-conscious bits of matter, unless consciousness is either fundamental already or involves some principle beyond current physics, like strong emergence?
So the answer really hinges on whether you believe physicalism can eventually solve the hard problem.
Pretty much. If a purely physicalist theory emerges that convincingly explains subjective experience, the motivation for non-physicalist views might fade. But until that happens, the explanatory gap leaves room for these alternatives. There are also attempts at middle ground, like bioprotopsychism mentioned in the sources, trying to find a naturalistic emergence linked to life processes without full-blown panpsychism or dualism. But yeah, whether consciousness is solely constituted by physical brain activity in a way that fully explains subjectivity, that remains deeply contested.
Okay, this leads directly to the next huge question, one with massive technological and ethical implications. Could artificial intelligence, AI, ever achieve true consciousness? Or is it doomed to just be incredibly sophisticated mimicry?
This is where those theoretical definitions we discussed become absolutely critical, because the answer you give depends almost entirely on how you define consciousness and which theory you subscribe to.
So if you're a functionalist,
if you take a functionalist stance, like GWT tends towards, where consciousness is defined by its functional role integrating information, making it globally available for flexible control, then in principle, yes. An AI that replicates those functions, that has the right kind of computational architecture for global access and control, could be considered conscious according to that definition.
What about IIT?
IIT also allows for AI consciousness in principle. If consciousness is integrated information, then an AI could be conscious if it has an architecture capable of supporting high OA. However, IIT proponents like Tononi are very skeptical about current digital computers, arguing their typical feed-forward serial processing is fundamentally different from the brain's recurrent integrated structure and likely generates very low I/O. But if you built an AI with the right kind of integrated recurrent architecture, maybe neuromorphic chips, then IIT wouldn't rule it out.
And emergentism.
Emergentism also suggests it's possible. If consciousness emerges from sufficient complexity and the right kind of organization, then a sufficiently advanced AI, perhaps one far beyond what we have now, could potentially reach that threshold and develop emergent consciousness. Some even argue if AI replicates all human cognitive functions, consciousness might just naturally arise.
Okay, those are the arguments for the possibility of true AI consciousness. What about the arguments against it, the ones saying AI will only ever simulate or mimic?
The biggest argument comes right back to subjective experience qualia, P consciousness. Critics argue that no matter how well an AI simulates intelligence, processes information, learns, communicates, even claims to have feelings, it simply lacks genuine first-person subjective awareness. The lights aren't on inside.
The hard problem again, but applied to silicon.
Exactly. Explaining how the AI computes doesn't explain why it should feel like anything to be that AI. It could just be incredibly complex algorithms running in the dark, so to speak.
Simulating pain versus feeling pain.
Precisely. Many also argue consciousness might be intrinsically tied to biology. Perhaps there's something unique about organic chemistry, neurobiological processes, the evolutionary history embedded in our wetware that's essential for consciousness and simply cannot be replicated in silicon or code. From this view, consciousness isn't just about information processing, it's a biological phenomenon.
Are there specific theories that seem to rule out current AI?
Well, some higher-order theories, which often link consciousness to having thoughts about one's own mental states, might argue current AI lacks the necessary kind of self-reflective metacognition. And the sources specifically mention the trilogy theory of consciousness, TTC, which makes a very strong claim.
Was its argument?
TTC argues AI cannot be conscious because it lacks what it calls the I. This I involves genuine awareness-based choice, linked to free will, not algorithms, and discretionary selection of intelligence for awareness, flexible, intentional attention. TTC claims current AI relies solely on system-constrained based algorithms, SCBA, which is fundamentally different. So no I, no consciousness, according to TT.
And we also run the risk of just seeing consciousness where it isn't, right? Anthropomorphism.
A huge risk. The sources emphasize this. We humans are primed to attribute minds, intentions, feelings. The chatbot understands me, the algorithm wants, to systems that are just running complex statistical pattern matching. We project humanity onto them, which can badly mislead us about their actual internal states, if any.
So how on earth can we tell? If an AI becomes super sophisticated, maybe even claims to be conscious, how could we possibly assess that? The Turing test seems useless here.
It's an immense challenge, maybe one of the biggest. The Turing test just checks for convincing behavior, which AI is getting scarily good at. Researchers are exploring other ideas, but nothing's definitive. There are tests for genuine creativity, the Lovelace test, ideas based on IIT to measure information integration in AI architectures, tests involving embodied interaction with the physical world, tasks requiring deep ethical reasoning, or specific probes for self-awareness.
Like asking it philosophical questions.
Yes, proposals like Schneider's AI consciousness test involve structured philosophical dialogues trying to gauge if the AI truly understands concepts related to phenomenal experience or if it's just cleverly manipulating text patterns. There are also behavioral scales like Porter's, looking for a suite of observable behaviors associated with consciousness in animals and humans.
So it feels like there's this fundamental tension. Tests based on function or behavior might suggest AI consciousness is plausible, maybe even inevitable. But tests trying to get at subjective experience or requiring specific architectures or biology suggest it's much harder, maybe impossible for current tech, where we just can't know.
Exactly. The core debate is mimicry versus genuine being. And the current consensus among experts, as noted in the sources, is clear. No existing AI system is conscious. The future, open question, dependent on major breakthroughs. But verification remains a massive hurdle.
And this whole debate has huge ethical implications, demanding we really understand what we're talking about before we build potentially conscious machines.
Absolutely. Which leads directly to the third major controversial area. The broader ethical landscape shaped by our understanding, or lack thereof, of consciousness. This isn't just abstract stuff. It affects real-world decisions now.
Right. Starting with AI ethics. If there's even a possibility of AI sentience.
Then we have to consider the possibility of AI suffering. If an AI could become conscious, it might deserve some form of moral consideration. This raises incredibly difficult questions about the ethics of creating such beings, experimenting on them, controlling them, potentially deleting them. And because AI can be copied so easily, there's a scary prospect of inadvertently creating vast amounts of digital suffering if we're not careful.
So we need guidelines now before we accidentally cross a line.
That's what many experts are urging. The sources mentioned calls for principles like prioritizing research on how to assess consciousness in AI, putting constraints on developing architectures thought likely to support it, taking a cautious, phased approach to deployment, being transparent about capabilities, and crucially, avoiding hype and exaggerated claims about creating conscious AI. There's also that risk of misattribution, treating non-conscious AI as if it's conscious, or worse, mistreating potentially conscious AI because we fail to recognize it.
Beyond AI, how does understanding consciousness impact animal rights?
Profoundly. The growing scientific evidence for complex cognition and likely subjective experiences in a much wider range of animals than we used to think, including many invertebrates like octopuses, bees, crabs, is really challenging the old anthropocentric view that consciousness is mainly a human or maybe vertebrate affair.
This is pushing us to expand our moral circle.
Exactly. It fuels calls for greater moral consideration for these animals' welfare. Initiatives like the New York Declaration on Animal Consciousness, mentioned in the sources, reflect this scientific shift towards recognizing animal sentience more broadly.
And this has practical consequences.
Yes, for research ethics, improving welfare, reducing animal use, agriculture, ethical questions about farming insects or crustaceans at massive scales, and conservation policy. Recognizing consciousness in other species encourages a deeper sense of responsibility towards all living things, fitting with broader ideas like One Health.
Finally, the impact in medicine, especially for patients with severe brain injuries, disorders of consciousness.
This is a critical area where neuroscience is directly impacting ethics right now. Techniques like fMRI and advanced EEG analysis are sometimes revealing covert consciousness. Meaning signs of awareness like understanding commands or even attempting to communicate through brain activity in patients who show no outward behavioral signs of consciousness. Patients previously diagnosed perhaps as being in a vegetative state.
Wow. The ethical implications must be huge.
Immense. It affects everything. Diagnosis, prognosis, decisions about continuing or withdrawing life support, pain management, involving patients in research, assessing their quality of life.
What are the specific challenges here?
Well, doing research ethically with patients who can't consent is obviously complex, relying heavily on stressed family members as proxies. There's the difficulty of assessing the patient's subjective experience. Is an intervention helping or causing distress? It makes risk-benefit analysis incredibly hard. And huge dilemmas exist around disclosing uncertain findings about covert consciousness to families, balancing potential hope against the risk of false hope or misinterpretation. Plus, ensuring fair access to these advanced diagnostic tools is an issue of justice.
So, across AI, animals, and medicine, studying consciousness isn't just academic. It forces constant refinement of our ethical responsibilities.
Absolutely. Our evolving understanding of who or what might possess a mind changes our moral landscape. And that tricky human tendency, anthropomorphism, plays a complex role fostering empathy for animals, often good, but leading to potential errors with AI, often bad. Being aware of that bias is critical for making objective assessments and taking responsible actions.
Okay, this has been an incredibly rich exploration. We've covered so much: ground definitions, the hard problem, theories, evidence, debates, and these profound ethical questions. Let's try to synthesize and evaluate. What are the main strengths and weaknesses of these different theoretical approaches?
Well, the sources suggest a core tension, right? It's often between explanatory ambition, trying to solve the deep philosophical problems, and empirical tractability, being scientifically testable. The deep theories can be hard to test, while the more functional testable theories might seem to miss the core philosophical mystery.
So IIT first. Strengths and weaknesses.
Strengths. It's principled, starts from the axioms of experience itself, which is appealing. It offers mathematical formalism with a bay, potentially applicable to diverse systems. It claims to explain some puzzles, like why the cerebellum, despite having tons of neurons, doesn't seem central to consciousness, maybe due to its less integrated structure. It makes specific predictions and directly tackles the hard problem via its identity claim.
Weaknesses.
Big ones. The computational intractability of A for complex systems like brains makes direct validation incredibly difficult. The panpsychist implications are highly controversial and criticized as untestable or even meaningless. Its axiomatic foundations are philosophical, not empirical, and are questioned by some. As we said, it's been labeled unscientific due to falsifiability concerns. And even if A correlates with consciousness level, does the A structure truly capture the subjective what it's like? That remains debated.
Okay, what about GWT? Strengths and weaknesses.
Strengths. It's functionally plausible, aligns well with cognitive psychology concepts like attention and working memory. It explains many observable characteristics of consciousness, limited capacity, serial nature, its role in novel situations, coordinating different processes. It's empirically testable through behavior and neuroimaging, with support for that neural ignition signature. It's amenable to computational modeling, and it offers a dynamic view of how conscious states emerge moment by moment. Weaknesses. The main criticism is that it primarily addresses a-consciousness, the access aspect, and may not really solve the hard problem of P-consciousness, the subjective feel. Why should global broadcast feel like anything? Also, the core mechanisms like broadcast and workspace can sometimes seem a bit metaphorical or vague, needing clearer definition. And there's still debate about the precise neural networks involved. Is it really prefrontal parietal, or are posterior regions more key? Some critics argue it essentially became a theory of cognitive access or reportability, not subjective experience itself.
An emergent property hypothesis. Strengths and weaknesses.
Strength. It has intuitive appeal. Complex systems often exhibit novel properties. It offers a way to reconcile physicalism with the apparent newness of consciousness. It arises from complexity. It's a broad framework that can potentially accommodate mechanisms proposed by IIT or GWT. It aligns with observations that consciousness depends on complex networks and is disrupted by damage or anesthesia. And the weak versus strong emergence distinction allows for nuance.
Weakness.
Emergence itself can sometimes be used vaguely, almost as a placeholder for we don't know how it happens. Strong emergence, in particular, is very difficult to demonstrate empirically and is criticized by some as being anti-naturalistic, mysterious, or lacking concrete evidence. And crucially, emergentism doesn't inherently solve the hard problem it describes, that consciousness arises from complexity, but not why that complexity should yield subjective experience in the first place. Reductionists would still argue all emergent phenomena are ultimately explainable by the parts and their laws, even if it's complicated.
Okay, so given these strengths and weaknesses, what insights do the sources offer about the plausibility of those controversial answers we discussed? First, consciousness beyond brain activity.
The persistence of the hard problem remains the main stumbling block for declaring pure physicalism victorious. While the correlation between brain and consciousness is undeniable, that explanatory gap regarding subjective experience keeps the door open for alternatives. Panpsychism, especially motivated by IIT, offers a radical but potentially coherent way to naturalize consciousness, though it faces its own major challenges: testability, intuition. Dualistic views, particularly property dualism, retain plausibility for those unconvinced that physicalism can account for qualia, despite the difficulties they face, like interaction or causal closure. Whether consciousness is solely constituted by brain activity in a way that accounts for experience, it remains fundamentally open and contested.
And the plausibility of AI achieving true consciousness.
This depends entirely on your chosen definition and theory. Functionalist views, like GWT, make it seem plausible, perhaps inevitable with enough complexity. IIT suggests it's plausible if AI has the right high architecture, but unlikely with current designs. Theories requiring a biological basis or specific properties like TTC's eye imply current AI is nowhere near true consciousness, and maybe never will be. The risk of anthropomorphism mistaking mimicry for sentience is extremely high. The expert consensus remains. No current AI is conscious. Future possibility. Depends on breakthroughs. And verification remains a monumental challenge. So plausibility is highly theory-dependent and currently low for existing systems.
And the ethical implications, they seem less about plausibility and more about unavoidable responsibility.
Exactly. The sources emphasize these aren't just future worries, they're shaping practices now. The potential for AI sentience demands proactive ethical guidelines. The recognition of animal consciousness is already driving changes in welfare and research. The detection of covert consciousness in patients is forcing reevaluation of medical care and decision-making. Our evolving understanding continuously expands the scope of moral consideration. The need for a cautious, informed, and constantly updated ethical approach seems paramount given the high stakes and uncertainty. And understanding our own biases, like anthropomorphism, is key to navigating this responsibly.
So, wrapping this all up, where does this leave us? What are the main conclusions and future directions?
Well, the field is clearly vibrant, incredibly interdisciplinary. Deep philosophical challenges are being met with increasingly sophisticated empirical science. But there's no single universally accepted theory. Each contender has strengths, but also significant weaknesses. The hard problem remains stubbornly central, unresolved, driving much of the debate.
What's needed to move forward?
The sources suggest progress requires a real synergy between different approaches. We need continued philosophical analysis for conceptual clarity and critique. We need advances in empirical neuroscience, better imaging, better ways to manipulate brain activity, clever experimental designs to test theoretical predictions and pin down those NCCs. Computational modeling and AI research are also crucial testing principles, exploring architectures, and studying unconventional systems.
Like diverse animals, patients with dose C, altered states like dreaming or psychedelics, future AI.
Exactly. That comparative data pushes boundaries and highlights ethical dimensions. A key direction emphasized is developing more robust, testable, falsifiable predictions from the theories. Things like those adversarial collaborations where competing camps design tests together are seen as a really positive step.
And the likely outcome. One winning theory.
Maybe not. It's possible a unified understanding will come from synthesizing insights from multiple approaches rather than a single victor. The current theoretical pluralism, the existence of multiple competing theories, might just reflect the sheer complexity of consciousness, perhaps a necessary phase we have to go through.
And the ethics will only become more pressing.
Undoubtedly. As our understanding of other minds deepens, human, animal, potentially artificial society will face increasingly complex moral questions. Fostering an informed, sensitive public conversation about all this is absolutely vital for navigating the future responsibly.
That leaves us with so much to think about. And maybe one final provocative thought for you, our listener, to ponder, drawing from some of the implications we touched on, particularly around IIT and panpsychism.
Okay.
If consciousness, or some fundamental aspect of it, like integrated information, isn't confined just to complex brains, if even simpler systems might possess some non-zero degree of it, some minimal what-it's-likeness, what would that really mean? How would it change how we view the universe, not just animals or AI, but maybe even ecosystems or fundamental physical processes? Could there be glimmers of subjectivity in places we've always assumed were completely inert?
That's a truly radical thought. It challenges our deepest assumptions about mind and matter.
Something to mull over. We really hope you found this deep dive into consciousness as fascinating and thought-provoking as we did. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration.
And thank you for providing such rich source material to work with.
If you enjoyed this, please, one last time, subscribe to the channel, Silent Mind Studio, and follow us for more deep dives into compelling topics like this every day. And please, keep the conversation going in the comments. Ask those lingering questions. Share your thoughts. We really value building that community around these complex ideas.